Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. It is week 11. We are almost at the end of semester. We have one more week of content and then your final assignment. Check out the introduction video this week for a bit more on the assignment, and make sure you check into the workshops, or if you missed the workshop, view the recording of the workshop, because we'll be doing important practice work for your final assignment. So this week we're looking obviously at social media, and we're looking at the different ways in which all the different lenses that we've used so far intersect in looking at an individual topic, in this case social media, and next week in terms of globalization. So it's important to remember that social media is a global platform. Most forms of social media are used throughout the world. However, the forms that we consider to be perhaps the only forms or the main forms that are used are not necessarily exclusively the case. So for example, the main social media platform in China is Weibo, and that certainly has a lot more users than Facebook or Twitter in that case. So when we talk about social media, just keep in mind that we're talking about a particular form or particular set of social media. So obviously there was media around before there was internet-based social media, and as is the case when anything new comes in, the traditional media has not always been delighted at social media and its ability to take away advertising and its capacity to distract the population. So many of you said last week, while you're watching TV or on your phones doing social media and so forth, so perhaps not giving the traditional media the attention they feel they deserve, and the ability to sell you as an audience to an advertiser. So there's definitely this idea of all new media being in competition, and we're going to touch on this particularly in terms of news media in traditional formats as well as in the social media context. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in the week on Convince, but we'll focus that in more this week, more specifically into this idea of it being a sort of a battle, in a way, between the two parties. So traditional media has, so when I say traditional media, I mean film, TV, newspapers, radio, that sort of thing. Of course, not all of them are traditional, and lots of them do things in new ways, but they fit into particular kinds of platforms that we're familiar with. So in terms of traditional media representations, social media tends to be shown in two different kinds of ways. It is either shown as a sort of an amazing means of liberation. So you'll remember in week 3 or maybe 4, we talked about Henry Jenkins and this idea of participatory culture, and that kind of attitude is coming through in how people view social media as something that everyone can participate in, and it's democratic, and you don't need to have heaps of money to run a newspaper. You can just put your ideas on Twitter and so forth and so forth. Now, there are definitely, if we think critically about this, there are definitely arguments against that position, precisely because these things tend to replicate the existing hierarchies, and, you know, along the lines of convergence, they're not necessarily divorced from the other companies that do run traditional media. But this is a sort of a key way of seeing it, and I'll show you a video that represents that perspective. Now, the other side of the coin is representation of social media as either dangerous in various kinds of ways, so full of dangerous predators, for example, or dangerous in its ability to make children not do their homework, or whatever the case may be, or also potentially that is going to use this term, stupid, that it is a sort of a dumbed down version of culture. There's also a lot of arguments you could make to counter these claims. And we'll talk about them a little bit more in relationship to some videos that I'm about to show. One particular sort of standout aspect of social media in recent years in relationship to the old and new media situation is that traditional media, so you're thinking CNN, BBC News, etc., using things like tweets as a source. So where once it was the idea, and going back to our week on Convince, that you needed to fact check and find information and interview people, the idea that in old media or a traditional media that is shrinking and is cutting jobs, for example, as you see with the Fairfax papers and so forth, you're not necessarily giving your journalists time to do that. They're going to become more and more reliant on Twitter. And I would sometimes this is good. So, for example, in watching an earthquake, if there's been an earthquake or a natural disaster of some kind, people can be able to post what's happening in their area, and then it can be spread by the news and so forth, and everyone has more information. But potentially we're not always talking about very accurate information or information you can check. So that is obviously an issue there as well. So if you go to the, I don't know why it's not showing up. Oh, it's locked. Okay. So if you go to out of this video and into one of the other YouTube videos, or go into it in a different tab, you will see a list of the videos. They are in order that I will be asking you to watch today. I want you to watch this video, which is a short clip from an episode of Parks and Recreation, the sitcom, and ask you to think about how social media is being represented in this clip, and maybe make some notes so that we can chat about it briefly in the workshop. So after that light interlude, I've been talking about the decline in traditional media forms, and as social media is rising, and you can see this on the screen here. This is particularly in the US, but similar things have been happening around the world. So this is the source is Reuters, which is excellent news gathering organisation. So trustworthy source, and you can see that social media, which is the little dotted yellow line, it has gone up sharply, even as printed newspapers have dropped quite radically, just in really quite a short period of time. So you can see why there is massive anxiety within the established news media in relationship to new media and social media forms. So BuzzFeed got their first political journalist in the Canberra press pool a couple of years ago, and people were a little bit suspicious of that. But I think it has those qualities, that it's both allowing for a wider variety of news to be shared, and also potentially undermining the ideals of journalism to be able to have the resources to go out and do really excellent exposés and stories and so forth, if they're having to compete with social media. So this is an article looking at how newspapers are trying to be like social media sources in order to compete with them. Because obviously, looking at that, there is a need for competition. And part of this has been through actually embracing the form. So New York Times, as you can see here, has posted an extremely large number of their headlines through Twitter. So it's not necessarily that people are reading people who would read their news based on Twitter link through to the New York Times. So they're still reading the New York Times. So the essential nature of getting online has been very important, but I guess the ways that you monetize that has been looked at differently. So you might have tried to access the Australian or Sydney Morning Herald more than a couple of times in a month, and there's a paywall, and they're like, oh, you have to subscribe to get more stories and this sort of thing. I guess a lot of questions arose that the old form of business practice was not working, and they had to figure out different ways to pay for creating the news and writing the news when a lot of social media based news and fake news and etc., as we looked at in the last couple of weeks, are not necessarily done by professional organisations, or if they are, they're powered very much by very mass the spreading of their message and advertising and so forth. There's of course issues of convergence, buying up providers of social media services, creating more online events. So again, trying to compete in terms of what you're doing with social media and online services. Promoting and monetizing user-generated content. Now, this is something that's been happening more and more with traditional newspapers as they've migrated online as an additional way to create revenue. I think it's too soon to tell how important this is going to be and what kind of a role it will play. But the idea is that an established organisation is trying to create a participatory culture around its publication. So instead of starting with that idea that everyone can post, the comments and the importance of comments has played a key role in this as well. A lot of people read newspapers online for the comments, or focus on the comments because they want to see what other people are saying about the same article. So that's performing, I guess, making it more like social media in that it's more of a conversation. Outsourcing news is of course a key issue, and associated again with job losses for journalists. The focus as well has been very much on creating this idea of branded communities and embracing sort of social citizen journalism in so much as it's helpful while not necessarily giving it equal standing. So while the newspaper industry has been challenged very much by social media, others, as I was saying, take a positive view of what social media can do and what it can do well. And I'll ask you to watch this video, which is about the role of social media in the so-called Arab Spring. So how social media can be used in the absence of necessarily a very open or free media to help activists communicate and help spread information and knowledge about things that aren't necessarily being reported otherwise. So I'll ask you to go ahead and watch that video. Others celebrate the technology, and this is, some of you might have encountered our Associate Professor of Speech Pathology, Bronwyn Hemsley, at this university, who's done some really amazing research into Twitter and how it can be used, and various other social media technologies as well, like Instagram, can be used to help people who have speech difficulties to communicate, especially in hospital settings where they might not otherwise be able to sort of communicate their needs in great detail. So I think this is relevant, this is important, because it speaks to the ways in which social media is fundamentally the same communication. So in the case of, say newspapers, it's the same story across the online and the non-online versions, but it's a different form of communication. Even if it's only a little bit different, that different form is really important. So thinking about the use of social media as a tool, please watch this video and consider how social media can be used as a tool of surveillance and a tool of, whether you see that as protection or 1984, store that up, but let me know what you think is going on in this video. There's been a lot in recent years about cyberbullying. So, of course, bullying of all kinds, unfortunately, has existed significantly before social media, but social media, I guess, takes it to a point where you can be quite divorced from what you're doing and what effect you're having and so forth. I don't know if some of you were at Toronto High when there was the mass suspension over a cyberbullying incident, and I guess that was an example of a principal taking a hard line and saying this is not acceptable. But what I think it points towards is the idea that, again, it's a different form of communication, and it thus has potentially different kinds of effects, different kinds of implications. Whether you want to say that's worse or better, I think the fact is that this new, it's not really a new form of bullying, but this way of spreading negativity about someone on a much larger scale can be extremely traumatic. So you can watch here a clip. I think it goes for 7 minutes, but only just watch the first 2 minutes or so, 2 to 3 minutes. An interview with a mother over an unfortunate situation in the US, and I will be interested to hear your thoughts on how social media is represented in this as a threat or potentially something that can be changed, monitored in various kinds of ways. And feel free to, as I said, save it up for the workshop or post below in the comments. So if I was to ask you, as I am going to in week 13, to respond to to construct an argument based on a video I've shown you, how would I go about doing it? So you've seen a few videos in this clip, and I'm going to do this example in light of the combination of those videos, but we'll look at one specific one a bit later on. So if I wanted to form an argument about this, I might go, the assembled videos present a complex relationship between traditional forms, that should be traditional forms of media, and social media. So that's an argument I could put on the basis of what has been presented here. How would I then go about giving more on that? I go, what stands out to me? Let me brainstorm what stands out to me. I noticed that on slide 5, it said there was a decline in newspaper readership. Okay, well, what are the implications of that? And why does that make it a complicated relationship? Okay, there's a decline, this rise, it's going to be economic impact. I'm showing through that I've understood these concepts in the course. That there's a bit, economic impact on sort of convergence, news media businesses, and then kind of going through the various things that stood out in relationship to what you saw in the videos. So that was maybe a little bit confusing. So keep tuned because I'm going to do another one at the end of the next video and so on, so that we make sure, or the video after, to make sure that you're clear on it, and we'll do an exercise work through it ourselves in the workshop. So thank you very much. I will see you later. Bye.